Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Tonight, Katie and I are going to be discussing trip planning, specifically how to plan a backpacking trip. And this has been an ongoing series that I think Katie and I have really been enjoying. So if you're new to this kind of program, welcome. If you're back, we appreciate your loyalty. Katie, what have been the previous topics we've done in this format?
We did a desert tutorial last week. We did winter backpacking with Richard.
That's right.
We did intro to canyoneering.
Right.
And then we did 3 of our guides. We had Michaela, Brian, and then who was the third one?
And what's going to be our next topic after this one?
We're going to do women-specific topics. So how backpacking is different for women than it is for men. I'm excited about that one.
Awesome. Yeah. So tonight's event is going to run for about 45 minutes. If you would like to submit questions, you can use the chat function on the right side of the screen. We have some questions that were sent to us by readers through our social media platform and in our Google form. And then we'll also try to get to these live events too. Katie and I have plenty of material to fill 45 minutes though.
Probably too much.
if it's crickets out there. So, all right, Katie, what are we talking about tonight?
We're talking about planning a backpacking trip. So do you want to set the stage a little bit in terms of, well, I'll start with this saying we're going to cover about 7 steps. So these are based on a blog post that Andrew wrote in 2020. And we're going to go deep into each of them. As Andrew was just saying, like we have a lot of material that we're going to want to cover tonight. Each of these could probably be its own topic, but we're going to stay sort of high level. We're going to cover like the foundations that are going to be applicable to most backpacking trips. And then if you have additional questions, you can put those in the chat. As Andrew said, tonight we're going to try and exercise restraint so that we can get through everything and then be going along and taking questions from the chat as we go. So, and then the last thing I was going to mention is that we'll mention a couple of resources tonight, and I'm going to put those in the blog post that we'll have the replay on Andrew's website after we finish tonight and put the blog post up tomorrow. So we're going to mention like some checklists and things like that, and that'll all be linked in that blog post tomorrow. So before we talk about why trip planning matters, Andrew, do you want to talk about your background and share?
Yeah, thank you. Because everyone's like, why is there a photo of Andrew in a desert carrying snowshoes? Yes. So the theme for our backgrounds tonight was trip planning faux pas. So this was one of my definitely one of the funnier ones for me. It was back in 2009. I was hiking the Hayduke Trail, which goes over the Henry Mountains, which in late February, March are still covered. So I picked up a pair of snowshoes in Height, which is right on the Colorado River, at the tail of Lake Powell, and I carried snowshoes through the desert and never used them, and I felt like an idiot. I mailed them back from Escalante. I'm not sure that the town of Escalante had ever seen a pair of snowshoes.
Right.
What are these?
They're not exactly light. Yeah, and I didn't put up a trip planning faux pas. I just chose a trip that I really enjoyed planning, which was hiking the Grand Canyon.
Okay, so we're going to go the bulk of the content tonight. It's on these 7 steps on how to plan a backpacking trip. But I think before we get to the steps, it's worth taking on a couple of prefacing topics. So the first is why is it important, or why would you plan a backpacking trip? And as Katie and I were discussing this event tonight, we both agreed that you actually don't have to plan a backpacking trip. You can wing it, and you can especially wing it if you're familiar with the conditions and the location. I mean, I think that you get to a certain point in your backpacking experience, and it's very easy for you to pull off a backpacking trip in your go-to area and a shorter trip with people you know and conditions that you're familiar with. But there are 2 primary benefits to planning a backpacking trip. The first is that it's safer. So you, as a result of the planning that you do, you'll end up with more appropriate equipment and supplies. You'll have an itinerary that's more appropriate for the conditions and for your skill set. And then the second thing is that I think that planning is necessary anytime that you want to push your the limits of your adventure boundaries. So what are your skills, your experience, and any trip that you want to kind of expand that comfort zone a little bit, you have to plan for it, at least to do it safely. So we're going to talk about these 7 steps, and we're going to present them as kind of this like sequential thing, but it's important to say that the planning process is not linear. So you'll often, as you're going through the planning process, you go from step 3 to 4. You might have to go back to step 1 because of something you discovered during step 4. So just realize that it's almost a little bit more cyclical than it is consecutive. Katie, let's talk about the resources that we are relying on really heavily during, like, when we're planning a backpacking trip. What are kind of the files or the templates that we're using if we're going to do like a full planning process? What are we using?
Yep. So the first one that I want to mention is the conditions assessment, and that's actually very top of mind because our Utah clients are going through their conditions assessment right now for the upcoming trip. So we have a conditions assessment template, which we're going to talk about this evening, the details of what's included in that. That's going to inform the gear list. That's another pretty time-consuming and critical piece of like the planning process, and we also use a spreadsheet for that. We use checklists a lot. So Andrew has a checklist, a trip planning checklist that kind of summarizes the action items from each of these steps, and we'll link to that. And then you can have a trip planner document, which I think is really helpful to just kind of be like a parking garage almost for all the details that you're gathering about expected conditions, permits, when certain roads are open or closed, all that sort of stuff can go into this trip planner document. And it's a very organized way of keeping that together. And then that can be given to your emergency contact as well when you leave, so that they have all that information. It's really helpful. And then the last item is like a meal planner spreadsheet, which can be really helpful as well. So we'll dive into that a little bit more.
Okay. So 2 other topics before we get to the steps. One is, let's talk about normal trips versus through hikes. So Katie and I both come from a through hiking background, but I'd say probably more recently or into like I don't want to say short things, but definitely shorter.
Yes.
So I think when you're talking about a through hike, it's best to think about it as a continuous series of short, like normal shorter trips of 3, 5, 7 days of that variety. And definitely in a through hike, though, the complexity gets magnified. So depending on the location, depending on the trail or the route that you might be doing, you might be looking at multiple wilderness permits instead of just one. You are looking at hundreds of miles or maybe even thousands of miles of topographic maps. You might have multiple places where you're resupplying along the way. In fact, not even might. You're going to have multiple places where you resupply along the way instead of just going into your storage room or your gear room. And then finally, the last thing is that during a through hike, if it is like the normal variety of like a Triple Crown type trail, the conditions are changing significantly enough over the course of your trip that you're also going to have to be swapping out gear and replacing gear. So you might start with a cooler, like a warmer sleeping bag, and then swap out to a lighter sleeping bag in the summer. And then you also are going to need things that most ordinary backpackers don't think of as supplies. Like you're going to need to, like, you look at socks as supplies. You're like, how many miles can I get out of a pair of socks? It's the same way. It's like, well, how many miles can I get out of a 12 pack of Cliff Bar builder bars? Like similar sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that the planning process for a really long hike, like a through hike, like 4 to 6 months, becomes a lot more manageable and less overwhelming to go through these steps, exactly like Andrew's saying, just for like one chunk at a time, to make sure, again, that you're planning the right gear, that you have that resupply covered for like each chunk along the way. And I think also from like a mindset perspective, when you're on the trail, I would always think of it as like, I'm just getting to the next resupply. And then not like I'm walking 2,500 miles or something. It's like, no, I just have to walk 100 miles or like 150. So, and then, yeah, before we dive into the steps, Andrew, do you want to discuss like length of time? Like how far out should someone start thinking about the planning process? Like, should they start the weekend before? Should they start a year before?
Well, it depends on the complexity of the trip.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about a trip that I am looking at for like 15 months from now. So yeah, it just depends on what you're trying to do. Whereas you can pull off an overnighter, or if you're good at it, you can, like, if I was like, hey, I want to go spend a night out in the woods tomorrow, I mean, I'm certain that I could wake up in the morning and pull everything together in a few hours. So, but I would say, like as a general thumb, my most ambitious trips took me as many months to plan as it took me to complete them. So like 6 months to plan my Alaska Yukon expedition and 6 months to do it.
I think especially when permits are involved as well, for certain areas, it's
Yeah,
important to be thinking that far out, and being aware that some of the tasks are going to take longer than others, like the gear list, for example, especially like you said, if it's in a place you haven't been or it's a long, complex trip.
So I have a question for you, Katie. Do you feel like I'm a much better trip planner now than I was even 10 or 15 years ago when I was doing all of my through hikes? But and I'm not sure if you would say the same about yourself, but I'm curious if you think that trip planning has gotten easier with the sort of the digitalization of or the digitizing of trip planning information, or do you think that we've just gotten better at it?
I think it's easier to access information. I mean, I can remember trip planning in like the early 2000s, and there just wasn't as much information out there. That could make it more complex if you don't know what your information you're looking for, though, because you could just get like lost in the sea of like opinions and trip reports and information. So I think that with experience, I've become better at like sorting out like what information do I need, and that's why I think having steps and like templates to use are super helpful, so that I don't just like get like lost in like trip reports and knowing what I'm looking for.
Funny you mentioned, like I remember my earliest trips. I mean, I remember literally ordering United States Geological Survey maps like by mail. It's like sounding a little old, but we've just been doing this a long time. Okay, so let's jump into these steps. So let's step number one. The way that we're going to do this, folks, is that this trip planning is best discussed if we make it kind of relevant. So Katie and I are going to be talking about specific trips that either we have coming up or that we've done, just to give you a very specific example rather than talking about it in this theoretical way. So, Katie, what's the first trip we're going to be talking about?
So I'm going to talk about my Sangre de Cristo Range traverse from last summer.
Okay. So the first step is that you need to define your trip parameters. So you might think about, like, remember if you've ever taken like a journalism class, you might remember like the 5 W's. And I think it's actually like a really good starting point for trip planning too. So I'm going to walk you through them. So the first is, Katie, where are you going?
So I'm going to the Sangre de Cristo Range in Colorado.
Okay. When are you going?
I went in the 3rd week of August last year.
Okay. And then in this specific context, we want to talk about why are you doing this trip? And we want to specifically talk about it in a way of is this a hiking oriented trip or is this a camping oriented trip?
My goals for that trip were to really challenge and push myself physically. So it was very much a hiking oriented trip. So I wanted to pretty much do as much vertical that I could do each day, which was my limiting factor. So
Katie's being humble. Even when she got back from that trip, I went, you did how much vertical per day?
It doesn't matter. It was plenty. Yeah. Can we go back and just real quick when thinking about the where and the when question, because I think that those two can be, the where will influence the when. So you might have, so if someone's thinking about planning a trip, you might have a certain destination in mind. So you might want to go to the Sierras. In that case, the when will be influenced by the where. So you're going to say, unless you have like snow travel skills, you are probably going to plan it for like midsummer, maybe. So like July, August, September. On the flip side of that, your when might influence your where. So you're like, well, I can't go whenever I want. I only have, late April off. In that case, you're probably not going to go to the High Sierra again, unless you have the skills to do that. You might be looking at somewhere in the Southwest in that instance. So I think it's helpful to think about how those, like if you're determining your location by the when or the where, how that might change how you think about that.
So we're getting a little bit ahead, but if you didn't know that the Sierra is snowbound from November through May, and if you when would you figure this out? And then this is a great example of what I was saying earlier. So
Yeah.
I'll give the answer. Yeah, go ahead. Take
Yeah,
it.
when you do your conditions assessment, as soon as you look at the climate, when you're starting to look at the average temperatures and the precipitation, and looking up maybe trip photos, or yeah, probably when you do your conditions assessment.
Right. So you do your conditions assessment, and you realize I can't go to the High Sierra in April, not unless you want skis. So
That's
and
right.
then you go back to step one and ask again the where and the when and the why. Okay. So after that where, when, why, the next thing you want to do, you want to be asking some more specifics, like what is the length or the duration of this trip?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in this Sangres example, the duration of the trip, I determined it by determining how much it's a certain mileage, right? I think it was 115 miles, and then it was, I think, about 55,000 feet of vertical. And so I determined what I thought that I could do, how much vertical, because that was going to be the limiting factor, how much vertical I could do in a day. And that's how I determined the length of the trip. So it was going to be a 7 to 8 day trip. So that's one way you could determine the length. If you want to cover a certain amount of ground, like a certain trail, a certain distance, and you want to figure out the length of the trip. But again, if you only have like a 7 day trip, then you would like work backwards in the other way, and you would figure out, I have 7 days. I know I can hike about whatever it is, 10, 15 miles per day. I'm going to find a loop or create a route that's 70 miles, 90 miles, or whatever fits into your time off.
Right. Okay. So you're also going to be asking questions like, what trails am I going to be following, or what route am I going to be following? What sort of landmarks or like named places do I want to hit along the way? Where am I going to be staying each night? Which, be wary of like saying exactly where I'm going to be camping each night unless I'm required to by the land agency. You want to figure out who else is going to join you. And then I think the other sort of big question with these with these parameters, these early parameters, is how many like known unknowns could derail my plans. So Katie, like let's dive into your trip a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what were so you were like, okay, 55,000 vertical feet of climbing. That's probably going to be 8 or 9 days for me. I know the route, but what were the sections that you were worried about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was following the spine of the Sangre de Cristo Ridge, and there was only established trail getting up to the first peak that I did, which was Blanca Peak on the southern end of the range, and that was the only trail that I was going to travel on the entire time. So I knew that I was going to be slowed down potentially by route finding. It's pretty straightforward. You're following the spine of a ridge north, so it's like kind of hard to get lost. Except when it was dense fog, which I happened to run into, then you could kind of follow side ridges. But anyways, navigation is something that could slow you down. And there were I scouted several sections of it before I hiked the trail, or before I hiked the route rather. But there were still some sections where I knew that there were like sections of class 4 or low 5th class ridgeline that I hadn't been on before. And I knew that those sections, it wasn't the vertical that was going to limit me. I was going to be slowed down by the technical aspect of it. So that's an example of an unknown. There was no water on the ridgeline, so I knew I was going to be slowed down by like dropping off the ridgeline at hopefully just once a day to grab water, and then having to climb back up in the morning. So those are some examples of some of those. Like, I knew that there would be unknowns, and I was going pretty much during monsoon season. So I knew that I could possibly be slowed down by weather, by having to bail off the ridge, which also happened.
So what's the way to deal with the known unknowns?
I think planning a little bit of buffer into your schedule. I think knowing what the unknowns could be. And so I spent a lot of time looking where are the places where I can bail off the ridge, trying to set myself up as much as I could, kind of guessing where I would end each day, but also having like option A, B, C, D. You know what I mean? Like I could get off here, I could get off here. Thinking through in advance, I think is really helpful. Doing a lot of research.
So the last piece of these parameters, so you want to just consider the logistics. So do I need permits? If so, how do I get them? When do I get them? Where do I get them? How am I going to travel to the starting point and from the end point? Where am I going to stay before and after the trip? And then are there any unique or notable land use regulations requirements, such as bear canisters or designated campsites, that kind of thing, that are going to just affect the trip overall? And then most of those parameters that we just discussed, they're going to end up in this trip planner template or trip planner document. And as Katie mentioned earlier, that's a document that you can very easily pass off to your emergency contacts, so they kind of know specifically like where you're going, the dates you're planning on doing, how you're going to get there, how you're going to get back. And it's a really useful tool for anyone who might need to figure out, God forbid, if something went wrong.
Yep.
Okay, so step number 2. So we've defined the parameters. Step number 2 is that we're going to research the conditions, or research the likely conditions. So the whole idea with researching conditions beforehand is so that you can prepare properly and mitigate risks and rule out all of those baseless, like what if or just in case scenarios. One of the themes that we see often in backpacking is that people pack their fears. So they're like, well, I don't know if I'm going to encounter any rattlesnakes, so I'm going to carry a rattlesnake kit. Or I don't want to be cold, so I'm going to carry a really warm sleeping bag. Or I don't know where all the water sources are, so I'm going to always carry more water than I need. And these sorts of things start adding up. So let's talk about, I'm going to drive this a little bit. I actually have some slides that I can show you. I'm going to flip my screen here. So the list of things that we look at, the first thing we look at is climate, and we're specifically interested in temperature and precipitation data. So the best resource for this data is from the National Centers for Environmental Information, and I've already taken you to the page, and I'm gonna focus this conditions assessment on Escalante, Utah, which is where we're running our first trips of the season next month. And this website will give you the average max temperature, minimum temperature, and then how much precipitation in each month. So, for example, at the end of April, which is kind of when we're starting to run our trips, we should be expecting average lows about 42 degrees, average highs of about 75. And then you would make a little bit of some adjustments for vertical change. So in this particular area, there's not a lot of vertical change. It's like 1,000 vertical feet from the town of Escalante up or down. So you might see temperatures that are like about 4 or 5 degrees cooler or warmer than what these averages are. You also notice that there's very little precipitation in the month of May. Also very little in April. So that's your climate data. The second thing you're going to look at is daylight. And daylight is really useful for understanding or maybe predicting like how many miles per day you can hike, especially if you're planning on being one of those like dawn to dusk hikers. If you're planning on doing any night hiking, this would also inform how bright of a headlamp you might need. So we like to use time and date. You can plug in an area like Escalante, and then it will give you, this is daylight savings here. And then it will tell you exactly how much through the month of April, when sunrise is, and all the rest. As far as predicting exactly how much daylight, what you want to be looking at is this nautical twilight, and let's see, there are a couple different twilights here. So astronomical twilight would be like in the morning. No. God, I don't even understand the differences here.
Usually
out here, I'm going to assume that just intuitively this nautical twilight, or it's the civil twilight that is
the civil twilight.
Yeah, so go by the civil twilight. That is going to kind of best define the daylight hours,
like the usable daylight. Yeah.
Okay. So we've climate, daylight. The next thing we want to look at is footing. So for footing, I often will use CalTopo. So this is a map of the Escalante River, or this is a satellite view of the Escalante River. This is the watershed. It flows down into Lake Powell. And if I zoom in on some of the areas where we might go, you'll see a lot of rock. And if you do a little bit more homework, you'll understand that this would be slick rock. And then all of these areas in between, this is all sand. Okay, so it's a mix of slick rock and sand. And another thing I can do with this satellite view is I can be looking at vegetation. So if I go down canyon a little bit, I think this is Harris Wash coming in. You'll notice that there's just very little vegetation if you're not down in the canyon bottoms. Down in the canyon bottom itself, like this is the main Escalante, you'll have cottonwoods here, but up on the benches, there's kind of no shade. Yep. You could also do look into things a little bit more when you're talking about vegetation. We're interested in like what is the nature of it. So not only just does it provide shade, but Is it pokey? Is it scratchy? Is it really thick? I'm going to actually, there's one other topic on footing that I think is worth discussing. So let me just, I'm going to tangent here for a second. So I'm going to take you to California. Here's the town of Lee Vining, which is on the east side of Tioga Road. And if you want to know, the best way to know like current footing or current snow coverage is that you can look into the Sentinel Weekly satellite data. And of course, if you've been following the news, California just had like this epic snowstorm. So there's basically like impossible to see how much snow coverage there is because of all the cloud cover still. And we're not interested in going backpacking anyway on March 6th, but you can see, but when it becomes really useful is that you can start looking back at the history. So for example, like the middle of July of last year, you can see where the snow coverage still was. So that's a great way of predicting the footing that you'll encounter on a trip. Let's keep on moving down these conditions assessment or these like factors that we're looking at. So we've talked about climate and daylight and footing and vegetation and sun exposure. The next thing you might look at is or consider is navigational aids. So I'm specifically interested in like, if you're going to be following trails, are they really well defined? Are they signed? Are there mileage markers? And probably the best resource for something like that would be in a guidebook or call a ranger station or the land agency offices, and you can ask them those questions and they'll do that. And the same thing goes for water availability. Well, a guidebook like this is Steve Allen's Canyoneering 3. It's like the resource for Escalante, and he's makes very good notes about whether a canyon has a perennial flow or a seasonal flow, and where you might find potholes. So a resource like that is invaluable. And the other things I would be looking at, I'd be looking at problematic wildlife, and we're mostly going to be concerned with rodents and with bears. So like the bears and the mini bears, you might want to be thinking about. Biting insects, so those would be mosquitoes or black flies or ticks. You're also going to be looking at, thinking about remoteness. I'm going to go back to my Escalante map, and you can just see in a map like this, you're like, oh, there's just not much. Here's the little town of Escalante, this quaint little town. We love spending time there. But there's nothing. There's no development anywhere where we're going to be backpacking. So it's a very remote area. A last thing you might want to be looking at is cell coverage, and Caltopo has this great layer. You can actually pick your carrier. So it's like, oh, I'm AT&T, and you can figure out where you might get cell coverage in this area. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and all of the findings that I do in this conditions assessment, they're going to go into this conditions assessment report, basically. And I talk about what I'm researching, what I found, and I identify my sources. And then something else you can do too is you can say, basically talk about the impact of this. So as an example, if we learned that black bears are a really big problem in Escalante, which they're not, but that might encourage you to then in the next step to carry like a bear canister.
Yeah, which we're going to talk about. We're going to go through like the gear list and like the implications, for example, of what it would be of these conditions in Escalante and how we would form a gear list from that. But I just want to mention a couple of things. So all of the websites that Andrew just mentioned are in a blog post called My Go-To Resources that we're going to link in the replay of this, because there were a couple questions in the chat about that. And you also have examples on your website, I believe, of conditions assessments that you've done from like the Yosemite High Route or maybe your Alaska.
There are a couple of like examples. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Which I think are really helpful to look at in terms of like, okay, what information am I looking for? And I'm trying to pull from these different websites.
Okay, so step 3, which Katie's going to own. So step 3 is selecting your gear. So we've defined our trip parameters. We have researched the conditions. The next step is that we're going to select gear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as we mentioned, so using a spreadsheet is really helpful for this. Andrew has a go-to template that we were actually just looking at earlier today. It's like a gear template where it has the categories for each type of gear, like things that you're wearing, your sleep system, your cook system, hydration, all of that, which is really great because then you make sure that you're not going to forget anything and you can go through it pretty much for every single trip. And so I'll use this template and I'll have a different one for the different places that I tend to hike a lot. So I have an Escalante template where I know it's like has the things that I need in it. And I just go through it each year, and I have one for like the Sierra in the summer, that type of thing. So I think it's helpful to have a spreadsheet that has all these different tabs of places that you hike often, based all off of this one template, because it's really good to like train your brain to kind of like go in a certain order. I think it's very helpful. So in terms of, so that's the kind of the way that I'm going to approach this, is how I would use those conditions that Andrew just went through to choose my gear for Escalante in late April, early May. So clothing system is usually the first thing we talk about, worn clothing. So I'll just go through a couple examples. I'm not going to go through like an entire gear list, but for example, Andrew talked about the sun exposure. Like there's a lot of sun. It's early spring. I'm not conditioned to the sun yet. So I'm going to make sure I have a lot of sun protection. I'm going to have a sun hoodie on. I'm going to have a hat that has full coverage. I'm going to have my sunglasses. I'm going to have sun gloves on. I'm going to wear long pants and make sure that I'm like fully protected from the sun. My clothing is also going to be protection from scratchy stuff because there's a lot of like pokey sage, there's cacti, there's rough sandstone. So again, that's another reason for wearing long sleeves and long pants. There's sometimes poison ivy in the canyon bottom, so I want to be protected from that as well. So that's what I'm thinking about, why I'm choosing the clothing that I'm choosing, which is essentially like all long sleeve clothing, but light things that I can wear in the heat. I'm not going to, in terms of element protection, I'm not going to pack much rain gear. I will pack a light raincoat, but not the raincoat that I would, I won't pack like a heavy 3-layer raincoat like I would for Alaska. I'm going to take something that's on the lighter side, and I'm probably not going to take rain pants at all. I'll check the forecast right before I go out, but unless there's like multiple days of extended rain, which is highly unlikely, I'll just leave my rain pants in the car. Whereas again, on a trip like Alaska or West Virginia, my rain pants are almost certainly coming with me.
So, Kay, let's just talk. So there's a lot of equipment that I feel like we recommend that clients carry. We kind of say like, hey, we want to see it at the trailhead, but we're hoping to leave it behind. So why not just wait until like the week before when you get a forecast? And you're like, okay, great. It's not going to rain this week. I don't need to bring my rain pants.
The closer I can pull a forecast to the time that I'm leaving, even up to like the night before, the morning of, the more accurate it's going to be, especially the longer you're going to be out. So if you're going to be out on a 5 or 7 day trip, it's more likely to be accurate for that long versus if you check it a week ahead of time.
But why not? My question is, I know you know the answer.
Maybe I'm misunderstood.
Why do we do all this planning ahead of time? Like we're going to have our Utah clients filling out their gear lists next week. Mm-hmm. So long before they can get an accurate forecast. But what I'm saying is why are we doing that rather than just waiting a week beforehand to make a decision about like what we need?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think so you can prepare, and so you can buy the things that you need to buy and like set yourself up for the most likely circumstance. And then it's easier to make a last minute tweak than it is to completely overhaul your whole gear.
That's the answer.
Okay.
Although Escalante Outfitters would love for you to run in and grab a pair of rain pants.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah. That just reminded me of like the absurd amount of money I bought at the first stop on the Appalachian Trail because I didn't know about researching conditions. Like I just guessed. I did the whole I might need this. It might be this temperature. I don't know. And I spent so much money there. Okay. Are we ready to move on to clothing, like stop and sleep?
Yeah, and I think we're just in the interest of time too. We're at 33 minutes, so maybe not go through all of these things, but just maybe hit a few more examples of just to show how the conditions assessment.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll jump to footwear then, because that's a huge one for our Utah trip specifically because there's so much sand there. So we have huge discussions around footwear for our Utah trips. So I'm finding something that's sand resistant, it's quick drying, and it's grippy on the slick rock. So that's an example of how I would apply the conditions to footwear. Let me jump down to shelter. So I'm thinking about how I'm going to be mostly trying to set up on slick rock or sand, which is pretty challenging. And I'm ideally wanting to cowboy camp because usually that location lends itself well to cowboy camping. So I'm going to bring a bivvy and a tarp as a backup probably, but I'm hoping to cowboy camp, and I'm going to bring something to keep me out of, like a piece of tieback or polycryo to keep me out of the sand for that. I'm going to use the average temperatures to determine what rating of sleeping bag I'm going to carry. I tend to sleep cold, so I'm going to carry like probably a 20-degree sleeping bag. If you sleep on the warmer side, maybe you want like a 30-degree. Hydration, I think, is a next system that I'll touch on. So you have researched where the water sources are, so I will know from researching that how far it is between water sources on my route, and I'll know the carrying capacity that I'll need to carry with me. So I don't need to carry an 8-liter carrying capacity because I know that I'm not ever going to go that far between sources. Right. And so, a 3 to 4 liter carrying capacity is adequate in this location, 5 maybe. And I think those are the main ones to touch on. I think that gives a good example of how you would use those conditions to inform what you're going to carry. Really, the whole idea is just, I see so many people really like using up a lot of mental energy and driving themselves crazy of like, well, what if this, and should I take this, or should I take my 20-degree or my 30-degree? Should I carry the mid layer or the puffy? And then just like look back at the temperatures and think about your past experiences. In the past, when you have hiked in 45-degree temperatures before, what have you needed to wear? Or like when you were hiking in the sun all day, what was comfortable to you? So I think, or at night, how cold have you slept in that sleeping bag? Was it comfortable? No? Okay, then bring the warmer one. So I just think,
what if you don't have that experience? Because that's a luxury that you and I both have, that you're talking like tens of thousands of miles and all these different environmental conditions that we know ourselves and we know exactly what we need. But I think part of the mistakes that you made on the Appalachian Trail and part of the mistakes that I made too is because I just didn't know. So what's the solution for a beginner to make sure that they have the right gear? Well, they could do they could do the conditions assessment and do it really well. And then they get to select it in their gear and they're like, I don't know how any of this translates.
I don't have that experience. Yeah. Well, I mean, you can sleep in your backyard. Like you can get some experience in like a safe environment that's really easy, and figure out what you're comfortable with. You can go on day hikes to figure out what you're comfortable with. It doesn't have to be a big epic trip of multiple months. And if you have some trusted sources in your resources in your life of people who have a little bit more experience, you could weigh in on that. But I would just be mindful about doing that because people's comfort levels are different. People have you might sleep warm, I might sleep cold, that kind of thing. So maybe just be mindful of who you're gathering information from. What would you say to that?
Reddit ultralight. Yeah. That's actually a really good one. I mean, if you're not sure, there's a great community. You can complete your gear list, put it up there, explain where you're going and what time of year and the conditions you expect to encounter, and ask them to critique you. That's a great resource. I'm a little wary, there are gear lists out there that people have posted, myself included, but be a little wary of those because it's difficult sometimes to understand their skill level, their budgetary limits or lack thereof. And then there are also a lot of people who have posted their gear and they just don't have their experiences are relatively limited. So congratulations, you've hiked the Pacific Crest Trail, once, right? But that doesn't mean that you're necessarily that your gear is appropriate for everyone else for doing even something similar.
Yep. Yeah. I think just be mindful of the source if you're going to be digging on the internet anywhere for any information. It's a life rule.
right. Life rule. Okay. So we've so here's the deal. So we've made it through 3 steps. So we've defined our parameters, we've researched the conditions, we've selected our gear. So step 4 is planning your food. So Katie, you're kind of the nutritional expert here. So maybe I'll try, but I would expect you to chime in too. So okay. Food is probably the place where we see most people packing their fears. It's just inevitable. And in a group setting, it actually sometimes works out okay. But inevitably, people just pack too much food. No one wants to be hungry. So I've had I remember a conversation. It was a multiple time alumni last summer, and he the last day of the trip, he pulls out the amount of food left. And he goes, Andrew, I finally did it. I finally packed just the right amount of food. And he's been on 3 or 4 trips, and every time he's getting closer and closer to getting the right amount of food. But he's always had too much. Kind of the theme. So be wary packing your food. I think it's when I pack my food, I kind of break it into 3 categories. breakfast is a category, snacks are a category, dinners are a category. And early on in a trip, I will add lunches to kind of that snack category. I think lunch, if you can have like a dedicated lunch on like days 2, 3, 4, maybe, that's really nice. It's difficult the further you get into a trip to still be having something that resembles a lunch. Katie, give me your top 3 lunches.
Well, the first few days out, always an avocado is coming with me. Usually, I like to have some sort of like hearty, like a little bit of like a hearty green or carrots or something, some sort of veggie that I can take like the first day or two that's like durable.
Yep.
But meat and cheese is like a go-to for me. I really like the fat and the protein because so many other foods tend to be on like the carby sweet side. So that's a go-to lunch.
It can get pretty boring eating like out of wrappers and bags.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so our recommendation when you're planning your food, our time-tested recommendation is that you are between a range of 2,250 calories to 2,750 calories per day per person. And you would be on the low end of this range if you're older, if you're more petite, if you are on a trip that isn't particularly aggressive, and you're going to be on the higher end of this range if you are younger, more muscular, larger bodied, and on an aggressive trip. And that's just the guideline the guideline that we kind of recommend if you don't know any better. But if you have your own, if you've gone on trips of your own and you know how much you need, then you should do that.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. Yeah, I think using past experience is the best way to go about it, and use trips that are similar to the exertion level, the amount of off trail, even the climate that are similar. And I know that's getting like pretty fine tuned in the weeds, but I think after you have enough experience, you can figure that out. Oh, when I go on a shoulder season trip and it's a little bit colder, I've realized that I need to pack a little bit more calories. Or if there's a lot of off trail or a lot of vertical, I also need to pack a few more calories. Yep. I think thinking about those things as you're starting to dial in can be helpful. What are the things that really increase my calorie output? Again, a lot of vertical, off-road travel, and being cold are a few of those. But I will also hammer home the idea of please use calories. It's really like the best way to do it. I think you can use weight, but like eyeballing it, I've just seen people cause themselves so much stress over like, oh, do I have enough? Like I'm like having like images of being in hotel rooms with thru hikers, like having their food out on the bed and like standing over it for like an hour, like adding things, pulling things away, like moving things into piles, or like holding a shopping bag and like weighing, like, like, oh, this feels like about 7 days. And just like spend that time and add up roughly what calories are in there, and like be just like set your mind at ease and just like know like, okay, I probably have enough that maybe like I'm gonna be okay. I might be a little hungry, but I'm not gonna starve. Like I've got enough.
I think that's a good point. It's inevitably on a back, especially a longer trip, you're going to be a little bit hungry. I mean, you're going to be really thankful to have that cheeseburger or pizza in the town. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to step 5. So step 5 is creating or collecting all of your navigational resources. So your route has been finalized. That kind of happened earlier in your trip parameters, and you might have had to edit it as you research the conditions, or and then so you're. When I talk about navigation resources, I'm talking about guidebooks, data books, topographic maps. I mean, if you are doing a do-it-yourself route, a guidebook might not exist, in which case you're going to be limited to the topographic maps. We love CalTopo for route planning and for printing large-scale maps. We like the Trails Illustrated maps for like a small scale map, for like an overview map. And then in addition to those two, like the large scale map and a small scale map, we also use a digital app, like a GPS app like CalTopo or a Gaia. Just do yourself a favor, confirm that, like go through the process of confirming that your maps are actually downloaded before you head out to the field. It's very disappointing to get out there and realize that the download wasn't successful and you don't have any maps on your phone. Katie, what's the long distance trail scene has changed quite a bit since I was last on one. But if you're planning on that kind of trail, what's the resource that you want to use?
I believe it's Far Out, formerly known as Guthooks. It's probably the go-to resource. Yeah.
What's your thought on having like just using a phone to walk 2,600 miles.
My thought, because I have the experience of doing that, is that you're really robbing yourself of a more full experience. I am like ashamed to say that there were times on the PCT where I don't think I knew what like national forest I was in. Like I knew roughly like where in like California I was. I was like, I think I'm about halfway through the state. But like I didn't really grasp the context of what was around me as much as I would if I had full paper maps. And now I just like love larger paper maps that I can really like see the contours of the land on there. And fortunately, when you're on a trail like that it's kind of hard to get lost. You can, it happens, but you know, it's pretty straightforward. But yeah, I think you just miss when you're just navigating on a tiny little screen, you really miss the context of what's around you. And it can also be a safety issue as well, because those printed maps may have exit routes on them and may have like a broader corridor, which you should know the broader corridor around you or have it downloaded on your app so that should you need to exit your route or your trail for some reason that you know the way out or you can find a way out. But yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying I think you miss the context of what you're doing, which is a real shame.
So remarkably, the Far Out app is probably still better than what was available 20 years ago, which was the Pacific Crest Trail guidebooks published by Mountaineers Press, where literally it was like they had the USGS maps like cut and like glued onto the page. Mm-hmm. So you would get just this like little sliver, like a 1 inch wide section of map. It was, or I remember some places where like some of the more confusing passes. So I feel like Selden Pass was, whoever had laid it out on the page, like it was 2 different 7.5 minute quadrangles and they didn't line up contour lines quite right. So, but
that's rough.
We keep going. All right, yeah, step 6. So after you have all your maps and you have your food and you have your gear and you know where you're going. So step 6 is to gain fitness and skills before you go. So let's talk about fitness a little bit. The key thing is just that confirming that your itinerary is appropriate for your fitness. So you want to be thinking about like, well, how many, like realistically and sustainably, how many miles a day can I hike? Or on really like aggressive routes, how much vertical gain and loss can I do on a particular day? So, Katie, if you just make the determination that you need to like improve your fitness before you go, what's the best thing to do?
My personal favorite and most effective way to do that are to get a lot of vertical gain and to wear a pack while I'm doing that, like adding weight. I think that's a great way to train if you have limited time. I mean, backpacking is the best way to train for backpacking.
Yeah.
If you need to speed the process up, I think doing hills and adding a weighted pack, running can be helpful. Do you want to speak?
I don't want to say can't. It definitely
is helpful. It is definitely helpful. Yeah. What are some things that we see that maybe are less helpful?
Yeah, so like not useful at all for hiking fitness is swimming or cycling. Yoga is like marginal because it does at least improve balance. And then any like just strength training that doesn't include any cardiovascular stress. So yeah, I've seen some, I mean, I've seen applications where they're like, I'm in top 5% in my Peloton class. I'm like, don't care.
I mean, it can be helpful for cardiovascular fitness, yes, but it doesn't translate the way that you think that it's going to.
It really doesn't.
And we've seen that time and time again. Yeah.
Okay, so how can we? So we talked about fitness. Let's talk about skills. So how can? So in addition to making sure that your fitness is appropriate or your itinerary is appropriate for your fitness, make sure that your itinerary is also appropriate for your skills. So a couple of examples. If you are planning a trip in a dry environment, then you want to have like some sense of how to plan water, like how much water do you need per day? How much water do you need per hour? That kind of thing. If you were planning a backpacking trip in the High Sierra in like early summer 2023, then you would really want to have had swift water and snow travel skills. If you're going to be planning a backpacking trip anywhere in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, you want to know how to or what to do if you encounter a grizzly bear. If you are going to be hiking in the Appalachians, Katie, what's like the most important skill hiking in the Appalachians?
To know how to withstand rain, extended periods of rain, mentally and physically. Yeah.
All right. And then finally, if you're going to be doing any off-trail trips, so like the Sierra High Route or something similar, then you need to know how to navigate.
Yes. How do you know which skills that you need for a trip?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, probably like reading some trip report or the conditions assessment would get at that. And then any good guidebook is also going to discuss, like, have some discussion of that as well. So I'm thinking of like Steve Allen's Canyoneering 3. He has like a great chapter on like critical canyoneering skills in for the Escalante area.
Mm-hmm.
So how could skills are hard to improve. Like I always say that like it's very easy to get really good gear. You just like create a gear list, put it up on Reddit Ultralight, and then take out your credit card and like just start shopping. Skills are hard. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the ways that we can improve our skills before a trip?
Mm-hmm. I think if you can find experienced partners to go out with, that is one of the best ways. If you can find people to go with, I think YouTube research, reading, Reddit, I think those are all great, but you also have to have the experiential piece. That's where it really like sinks into. It's like having the lived knowledge, the felt experience of it. I think that's where the skill really comes from. The reading ahead of time is great, but actually doing the thing is helpful. We encourage our clients, and something I will do myself, is go on a shakeout hike. I think that's really valuable. What are some other ones that you recommend, Andrew, or that you think
you can sleep if you're worried at all about whether you're going to sleep warm, you can start sleeping in your backyard, figuring out the limits of your sleep system. You can learn how to navigate, believe it or not, by like printing out a good map of your neighborhood or local park and just like trying to figure out how to use your, how to dead reckon, how to use your compass, and how to use your GPS. Like really, like all of those skills can be done in a low risk setting.
Yep. That actually just reminded me of one of the questions that came in through the form. Of someone was asking about transitioning from more established trails like the AT and PCT to doing more routes that had off-trail portions on them. And we get that question a lot on our trips as well, of like, how do I start building routes or getting more comfortable doing routes? And what you just said about navigating around your neighborhood or a local park, that's something that a recommendation I often give is like practice your off-trail navigation skills in a low risk, safe environment. So, veer away from that established trail, do some off-trail navigation, use your compass, use your map, and then navigate back to that trail. So that's a tip.
It's really helpful to have those skills be more second nature before you really need them. Mm-hmm. So it's the same thing with like setting up your shelter. Like you really want to know how to set up your shelter well before you pull into camp and it's raining on you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so the final step to planning a backpacking trip is to basically just do a systems check. And this would involve like packing up all your gear, and I would recommend using the checklist in your gear list to help you with that. You get all your maps and all your resources and your printed permit. Go ahead and buy all of the perishable foods you need, like cheese, butter,
avocados,
yeah, salami. Look at the short-term forecast. Usually like 5 days is pretty reliable. 7 days is less reliable, but at least it'll give you an idea about something that might be coming in or something that might be moving out. Proofread your trip planner, leave it with your emergency contacts, and then just go through that whole like trip planning checklist that we referenced earlier. And I write it all down because it's difficult to remember like 50 things. It's much easier just to follow a list of like, oh yeah, water the house plants. Like, you don't want to forget that, or like, schedule the cat sitter, like, because that's in this house, that's very important. So, so anyway, so use that checklist to just go through, and then you're off, and then the fun part begins. Life gets a lot simpler once you're actually out on the trail.
Yep.
I enjoy the planning process, but I enjoy being out there more.
Absolutely. I always feel like a palpable sense of relief of like, okay, there's no more, and there's nothing to worry about anymore. I'm just doing the thing.
Right.
Like I'm out here. It's great.
I feel like a lot of times too, and especially when I'm guiding, I sometimes get out onto the trail or like leave the trailhead, and I'm like, well, like, because it's usually such a rush, especially like running the program, like organizing the trips. Like, I'm usually like, well, I I think I have everything I need in my backpack, but if
No.
I don't, I'll just have to deal.
Yep.
So yeah. Okay, so folks, that's probably pretty good. 55 minutes, we're a little over, but we appreciate you joining us tonight. As we referenced early on in this, our next live event will be at the end of this month or the beginning of next. And the topic, Katie, will be
a discussion of all the ways that backpacking is inherently different for women than for men.
we're going to have to, I can maybe moderate that one, but we're going to have to get a third person in on this.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm under equipped. So, all right. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.